He ruthlessly kicked his pregnant wife completely out into the freezing rain, entirely with nothing but the cheap clothes on her back, arrogantly convinced she was the pathetic anchor violently holding his massive empire down. Exactly 6 agonizing months later, she confidently walked into the absolute most exclusive restaurant in the city, heavily pregnant, holding the hand of the absolute only terrifying billionaire he fiercely feared. And that was absolutely only the beginning of his catastrophic, total annihilation. Welcome back, my beautiful family. If you love highly explosive, deeply emotional stories about massive karma, brutal regrets, and the absolute ultimate revenge that doesn't even need to scream to completely destroy you, you are exactly where you need to be. Before we dive into this terrifying reckoning, please smash that like button, subscribe to our channel, and share your fierce thoughts in the comments below. Let's get directly into the silent revenge. The silent revenge, the fall of a king. The massive, highly glittering chandeliers, entirely in the luxury gardens of l'Orangerie, were absolutely not made of cheap glass. They were flawlessly crafted entirely of authentic, massive diamonds. Or at least, that was the highly arrogant, toxic rumor that Bruno Torres loved to aggressively spread. It perfectly, flawlessly fit his highly curated, elite narrative. He was the brilliant man who miraculously transformed cheap sand directly into solid gold. The terrifying, massive tech magnate who aggressively emerged completely from the violent, highly dangerous streets entirely to confidently claim the most highly exclusive, multi-million-dollar penthouses in the entire city. Tonight, Bruno sat highly arrogantly, entirely at the absolute best, highly coveted table in the massive house. The exact specific one, strictly reserved exclusively for elite royalty and powerful presidents. Directly across entirely from him sat Camila, a highly stunning, 23-year-old Instagram model whose absolute physical beauty was exactly as undeniable as her complete, utter lack entirely of highly intelligent conversation. She was aggressively, mindlessly, scrolling completely through her highly curated Instagram feed. Her flawlessly manicured thumb constantly hovering entirely over heavily filtered, fake photos of herself. "Put the damn phone completely away, Camila," Bruno stated, his deep voice incredibly low, but violently cutting. "We are actively celebrating. The massive multi-billion-dollar corporate merger flawlessly succeeded. I am, officially, legally, the absolute majority shareholder." Camila slowly looked completely up, her massive, bright blue eyes incredibly vacant. "Oh, right, yay baby, does that explicitly mean we can finally, aggressively buy that massive luxury villa completely on Lake Como exactly now? The highly expensive one perfectly with the private pier completely for the massive yacht." Bruno smoothly swirled his highly expensive, vintage Pinot Noir, physically feeling a highly familiar, incredibly dull ache completely in his heavy chest. It was the highly toxic, massive pain entirely of absolute boredom. "We can aggressively buy the entire damn lake if we fiercely want to," he murmured softly. Although the massive, arrogant thrill entirely of actually saying it had completely, permanently vanished. Exactly 6 agonizing months. That was the exact, highly specific amount of time completely since he had ruthlessly, violently divorced Mariana. The beautiful name absolutely still physically tasted exactly like bitter ashes entirely in his dry mouth. She had absolutely been his highly loyal, sweet college sweetheart. The beautiful, dedicated woman who had lovingly mended his cheap socks exactly when he absolutely couldn't afford to aggressively buy brand new ones. The highly brilliant woman who had fiercely stayed completely awake the entire agonizing night, meticulously revising and flawlessly perfecting his absolute first highly complex business plans. But exactly as Bruno's massive bank account aggressively, exponentially grew, Mariana beautifully, stubbornly remained exactly the same. Highly simple. She fiercely loved highly quiet, peaceful nights. She comfortably wore highly sensible, comfortable shoes. She absolutely did not fiercely know exactly how to highly toxically charm elite investors or aggressively command a massive crowded room. Bruno had arrogantly, toxically convinced himself that he had completely, massively outgrown her. He arrogantly needed a highly flashy elite status symbol completely on his broad arm. Absolutely not a highly equal, brilliant partner. So, he aggressively did it incredibly brutally. He vividly, highly agonizingly remembered that horrific day. He had aggressively handed her the highly toxic divorce papers and a highly insulting, cheap check, arrogantly telling her that she absolutely did not flawlessly fit completely into his massive, elite future. She absolutely did not violently scream. She absolutely did not aggressively throw a heavy vase. She simply looked deeply, directly at him completely, with beautiful eyes, entirely full of highly quiet, absolute, devastating sadness, and whispered incredibly softly, "You will profoundly learn the absolute terrifying price of this, Bruno." And she confidently walked completely out directly into the freezing rain. "Bruno, you are completely spacing out," Camila loudly whined, aggressively tapping her silver fork entirely against her expensive crystal wine glass. "I explicitly ordered the massive lobster, but the highly arrogant waiter is aggressively ignoring me." "He absolutely isn't actively ignoring you. He is incredibly busy," Bruno violently snapped, his highly toxic patience aggressively wearing completely thin. Suddenly, the highly ambient, loud noise entirely of the massive restaurant, the soft jazz, the highly constant murmur entirely of elite conversation, the highly elegant clinking entirely of expensive silver, completely, violently. It absolutely wasn't a highly gradual, slow fade. It was an abrupt, highly collective, massive gasp. Bruno frowned incredibly deeply. L'Orangerie was highly frequently visited entirely by massive A-list celebrities, absolutely every single day. A highly deafening, absolute silence exactly like this explicitly meant that absolutely someone truly, genuinely, terrifyingly powerful had confidently arrived. "Who exactly is that?" Camilla asked, aggressively craning her highly slender neck. "Is it a massive movie star?" Bruno slightly turned his heavy chair entirely to highly actively look directly toward the massive grand entrance. The elite maitre d', a highly arrogant man named Pierre, who absolutely always looked completely at absolutely everyone, completely with highly toxic disdain, was currently, actively, practically bowing completely to the hard floor. Exactly two highly imposing figures confidently entered, heavily flanked entirely by exactly four massive, highly terrifying security guards, who aggressively moved completely with the highly silent, absolute lethality, entirely of highly elite, trained military. The highly powerful man was incredibly tall, easily over 6 feet 3 inches, flawlessly wearing a highly bespoke, charcoal gray tailored suit that highly likely cost significantly more than Bruno's absolute first car. He possessed distinguished silver hair and a highly sharp jawline that visually looked exactly as if it were flawlessly carved entirely out of solid granite. Bruno completely, utterly froze. He profoundly knew that terrifying man. Absolutely everyone entirely in the massive elite business world profoundly knew exactly who he was. It was Ricardo Vargas, the terrifying, absolute global CEO entirely of Vargas Global. The exact massive man who legally owned the highly massive shipping lines that Bruno aggressively used, the highly advanced satellites that Bruno expensively rented, and the massive, elite banks completely from which Bruno aggressively borrowed massive amounts of money. Ricardo Vargas was highly terrifying, old money, incredibly lethal, massive power. He was an absolute apex shark that even other highly toxic sharks desperately swam completely away from. But it absolutely wasn't Ricardo who aggressively caused absolutely all the blood to completely, violently drain entirely from Bruno's handsome face. It was the incredibly beautiful woman fiercely holding Ricardo's massive arm. She was flawlessly wearing a highly stunning, emerald green silk designer gown that perfectly, beautifully clung entirely to her incredible curves, completely, before gracefully cascading completely to the floor. Her beautiful hair, absolutely previously, usually tied completely in a highly messy bun, beautifully fell entirely in highly lustrous, flawlessly polished waves completely down her back. She flawlessly wore a highly massive, highly expensive sapphire necklace that beautifully caught the bright light, brilliantly sparkling, exactly like highly intense blue fire. It was Mariana, but it absolutely wasn't the highly simple, quiet Mariana he arrogantly knew. The highly timid, pathetic little mouse had completely, permanently vanished. This incredible woman confidently walked completely, with her beautiful head held incredibly high. Her piercing gaze flawlessly sweeping the massive room completely with a highly serene, utterly terrifying, absolute confidence. And then, Bruno vividly saw it. The highly expensive silk dress was meticulously, flawlessly tailored to perfectly accommodate the highly undeniable, highly prominent, beautiful round bump entirely of her massive belly. She was heavily, beautifully pregnant. Bruno's massive grip, entirely on his expensive crystal wine glass, violently tightened so incredibly hard that the highly fragile stem violently snapped. Bright red wine aggressively spilled completely over the highly pristine, white tablecloth, visually looking incredibly, highly disturbingly, exactly like bright blood. Oh my absolute God! Bruno, look exactly at what you violently did! Camilla shrieked highly loudly, aggressively jumping completely backward, entirely to violently avoid the messy splash. Bruno absolutely did not hear her. He literally could not successfully hear absolutely anything completely over the highly deafening, massive roar entirely in his ears. Pregnant. She was actively at least exactly 7 months pregnant. He frantically, aggressively, did the highly terrifying math completely in his brilliant head. Exactly 6 agonizing months completely since the brutal divorce. Exactly 7 months, heavily pregnant. The massive room physically seemed to violently tilt completely on its axis. Was the baby absolutely his? Or had she aggressively moved completely on so incredibly, highly quickly, as the highly terrified host actively led Ricardo and Mariana completely through the massive restaurant? They actively had to confidently walk completely past Bruno's highly prominent table. Bruno physically felt completely, utterly paralyzed, entirely incapable, entirely of violently looking completely away. He arrogantly expected Mariana to pathetically shrink completely back, to submissively look completely down, to cowardly hide. Instead, exactly as they confidently approached, Mariana's beautiful eyes fiercely locked directly onto his, There was absolutely zero toxic fear entirely in them. Absolutely zero pathetic love. There was absolutely also only a highly freezing, perfectly polished, absolute indifference. Exactly like casually looking completely at a highly pathetic, insignificant stranger entirely on the subway. Ricardo Vargas highly protectively placed a massive, highly gentle hand completely on Mariana's beautiful back, smoothly leaning entirely in to softly whisper absolutely something completely in her ear. Mariana laughed beautifully, a highly genuine, incredibly musical sound that Bruno had absolutely not vividly heard entirely in agonizing years. They confidently walked completely past him, beautifully leaving a highly intoxicating, expensive scent entirely of fresh jasmine and highly elite cologne completely in their highly powerful wake. "Wait!" Camilla whispered highly toxically, her highly vacant eyes aggressively narrowing. "Isn't that officially your highly pathetic, tacky ex-wife?" Bruno stared blankly entirely at the bright red stain actively spreading completely across the white tablecloth. "Yes," he stated highly hoarsely, his deep voice sounding incredibly strange completely to his absolute own ears. "That is officially Mariana." The highly terrified waiter aggressively rushed completely over entirely to frantically clean completely up the massive spill, highly profusely apologizing completely as if it were highly, entirely his absolute fault that Bruno had completely, violently lost his absolute composure. Bruno aggressively, violently dismissed him, his massive appetite completely, permanently gone. "I absolutely do not completely understand," Camilla stated, highly annoyingly poking entirely at her expensive bread. "You arrogantly said she was completely broke. You explicitly said she was absolutely a nobody. Why the hell is she actively completely with him? That is Ricardo Vargas. My highly wealthy father explicitly says that Ricardo Vargas could easily buy this entire damn city completely if he fiercely wanted to. I absolutely do not know, Camilla." Bruno violently snapped significantly louder than he intended. Loudly enough that a highly wealthy couple completely nearby actively looked completely over. He aggressively lowered his deep voice, his massive fists violently clenched completely under the small table. "I absolutely do not know." The confrontation of giants, on the absolute other side entirely of the massive room, Ricardo and Mariana were peacefully seated entirely at the highly exclusive, highly private alcove table. The exact, highly coveted table that absolutely not even Bruno could highly successfully reserve. It beautifully offered a highly panoramic, stunning view entirely of the massive Sao Paulo skyline, but possessed highly enough absolute privacy entirely to be completely, utterly discreet. Bruno intensely watched them exactly like a highly predatory hawk. He vividly saw Ricardo gracefully, highly politely, pull completely out Mariana's heavy chair. He vividly saw exactly how the highly elite waiters actively hovered completely around them, flawlessly treating Mariana exactly like an absolute, untouchable queen. But exactly what aggressively, violently corroded him the absolute most was the exact, beautiful way Ricardo looked deeply directly at her. It absolutely wasn't the highly toxic look entirely of an arrogant man, completely with a highly cheap, pathetic trophy mistress. It was an absolute, profound look entirely of pure, unadulterated adoration. And the exact, highly gentle way his massive hand beautifully rested, highly softly, completely on her massive belly. Exactly when he heavily sat, completely down. That highly beautiful gesture visually seemed highly possessive, incredibly protective, utterly, completely paternal. Is it absolutely his child? Bruno's brilliant mind violently raced. Absolutely impossible. We were actively completely together exactly 7 short months ago. It absolutely must be entirely mine, but she absolutely never, ever explicitly told me. A highly sudden, massive wave entirely of highly toxic arrogance violently washed completely over him. If that was officially his biological heir, he possessed the absolute, undeniable right to explicitly know. He was Bruno Torres. He absolutely wasn't aggressively kept completely in the highly terrifying dark. I am actively going directly to the restroom, Bruno completely lied, violently standing completely up, highly abruptly. Do absolutely not aggressively take highly long, Camilla pouted highly annoyingly. I desperately want expensive dessert. Bruno violently ignored her and confidently strode completely across the massive dining room. He absolutely did not go completely to the restroom. He confidently walked directly straight, entirely to the highly exclusive alcove. His massive heart violently hammered entirely against his ribs. A highly complex mixture entirely of white-hot rage and a highly strange, completely sudden massive desperation that he absolutely had not actively expected to fiercely feel. As he confidently approached, exactly 2 highly massive, heavily armed men, completely in dark suits, aggressively stepped completely out, entirely from the dark shadows, flawlessly, violently blocking his absolute path. Aggressively make absolute way, Bruno fiercely demanded, desperately attempting to successfully summon his highly toxic CEO authority. I'm officially a highly close acquaintance. Mr. Vargas is absolutely not actively receiving absolutely any highly unexpected visitors. Exactly 1 entirely of the elite guards stated completely, with a highly monotonous, incredibly bored voice. Generously let him safely pass, Marcos. A highly deep, terrifyingly powerful voice confidently called entirely from the massive table. The elite guards flawlessly separated. Bruno confidently entered the highly exclusive alcove. Mariana absolutely didn't even bother to actively raise her beautiful eyes completely from the highly expensive menu. She visually looked completely, utterly radiant. Her flawless skin beautifully glowing completely with highly healthy pregnancy hormones. Her beautiful cheeks highly flushed. She visually looked significantly healthier and infinitely more beautiful than absolutely ever completely during their toxic marriage. Mariana, Bruno stated completely with a highly tense, thick voice. She incredibly slowly lowered the expensive menu. Her piercing honey-colored eyes fiercely met his, completely freezing cold and highly distant. Hello, Bruno. I highly accurately imagined exactly how incredibly long it would actively take entirely for you to aggressively come completely over here. Are you actively pregnant? He violently blurted completely out. Highly observant exactly as absolutely always, she replied, her beautiful tone incredibly, freezing dry. Yes. Bruno intensely looked directly at Ricardo, who was actively observing him completely with a highly amused, incredibly predatory smirk. Quietly, smoothly sipping his highly expensive vintage whiskey. Bruno intensely looked completely back entirely at Mariana's massive belly. Is it officially mine? Mariana let out a highly short, incredibly incredulous, highly toxic laugh. Yours, Bruno! You completely, violently, permanently lost the absolute right to explicitly ask that highly specific question entirely on the exact night you violently kicked me completely out, entirely of our shared home, completely at exactly 11 p.m., simply because I arrogantly lacked massive corporate vision. If that biological child is officially mine, I legally possess massive rights, Bruno hissed violently, aggressively taking exactly one highly threatening step completely closer. I actively possess highly elite lawyers who can aggressively— Sit completely down, boy, Ricardo Vargas spoke. He absolutely did not violently yell. He absolutely did not physically stand completely up. He simply spoke. And the absolute terrifying command entirely in his deep voice was so incredibly, utterly absolute that Bruno actually, violently, completely, stopped dead, entirely, mid-step. Mr. Torres, Ricardo aggressively continued, smoothly swirling his expensive drink. You highly actively seem to absolutely be completely under some highly pathetic misconceptions. Generously let me flawlessly clarify absolutely all of them, completely first. Absolutely do not violently raise your highly toxic voice completely to my beautiful fiancée. It actively disturbs the beautiful baby. Fiancé. The heavy word violently hit Bruno exactly like a massive, physical blow. Secondly, Ricardo stated, his piercing eyes violently hardening completely into solid steel. Regarding absolute biological paternity, you were so incredibly blindly busy aggressively chasing your— Exactly what the hell is she? A highly pathetic Instagram model? You were so incredibly busy actively chasing her completely during the absolute last agonizing year entirely of your toxic marriage that you barely even actively touched your beautiful wife. We absolutely both profoundly know the highly exact biological timeline, Bruno. Do absolutely not highly pathetically embarrass yourself completely by toxically pretending you were a highly present, loving husband. Bruno's handsome face violently turned bright red. He intensely looked directly at Mariana, frantically searching entirely for a highly tiny, microscopic crack, entirely in her impenetrable armor. Mariana, explicitly tell him exactly who I truly am. I explicitly told him exactly who you completely were, Bruno, Mariana stated incredibly softly. She gently placed her soft hand completely on her massive belly. I explicitly told him that you were the highly toxic man who maliciously made me physically feel incredibly small, entirely so you could arrogantly feel incredibly massive. I explicitly told him that you were the highly toxic man who cruelly told me I was completely worthless. She gracefully reached completely out and gently took Ricardo's massive hand. And then, Ricardo beautifully showed me that I was absolutely priceless. Are you actively completely with him entirely for the massive money? Bruno spat violently, his highly fragile, toxic ego violently fracturing. That is absolutely it, isn't it? You successfully traded the pathetic millionaire completely for the massive billionaire? You are absolutely just a highly pathetic gold digger, Mariana. The entire alcove violently plummeted exactly 10 degrees. Ricardo smoothly placed his expensive crystal glass completely on the massive table. The highly soft sound was incredibly low, but it violently echoed exactly like a highly lethal gunshot. Be incredibly careful, Ricardo whispered highly terrifyingly. You are actively, highly disrespectfully speaking completely to the absolute president entirely of the massive Vargas Foundation. And completely unlike you, Bruno, she absolutely did not highly arrogantly inherit her massive worth or maliciously steal it. She beautifully rebuilt herself entirely from the massive ruins exactly where you violently left her. At that exact, highly chaotic moment, Camilla, highly impatient and incredibly ignorant, loudly stomped completely over entirely to the massive table entirely in her highly expensive heels. She looked intensely completely between the three of them, physically feeling the highly massive tension, but completely, utterly lacking the basic intelligence to flawlessly read the highly toxic room. "Baby, exactly what the hell is actively taking so incredibly long?" Camilla loudly whined, aggressively grabbing Bruno's massive arm. She intensely looked directly at Mariana and highly toxically mocked her. "Oh, it is absolutely you. Wow, you have aggressively gained massive weight. I highly guess the brutal divorce absolutely didn't successfully do you completely well." The highly heavy silence that violently followed was absolutely deafening. Mariana absolutely did not violently get angry. She simply smiled, a highly slow, incredibly pitying, beautiful smile. "And you absolutely must officially be Camilla. Bruno has absolutely always possessed a highly pathetic taste entirely for cheap things that aggressively sparkle, but possess absolutely zero true value." Camilla violently gasped. "Excuse me?" "You can absolutely fiercely keep him," Mariana stated smoothly, completely returning her intense attention entirely to the expensive menu. "I absolutely already successfully discarded him, but exactly one piece entirely of highly valuable advice, sweetheart. Meticulously check the highly complex prenuptial agreement. Bruno is incredibly, toxically protective entirely of his pathetic pennies." Ricardo laughed highly darkly. "Get them completely out entirely of here, Marcos. They are aggressively ruining my massive appetite." The massive security guard violently stepped completely forward, his highly imposing, massive size completely overwhelming. "This is absolutely not permanently over, Mariana," Bruno violently snarled, exactly as the elite guards aggressively ushered him completely away. "You absolutely cannot maliciously hide my biological son completely from me. I will violently, aggressively destroy you completely in federal court." Ricardo Vargas confidently stood completely up. He absolutely towered entirely over Bruno. He leaned incredibly close, his deep voice a highly low, terrifying rumble completely near Bruno's ear. "If you absolutely ever actively try to legally sue her, if you absolutely ever actively try to aggressively harass her, if you absolutely even actively look completely in her exact direction ever again, I will absolutely not entirely just legally sue you, Bruno. I will aggressively buy your entire massive company, violently dismantle it completely for cheap parts, and ruthlessly leave you completely with absolutely nothing but that highly cheap, pathetic suit entirely on your back. Do absolutely not fiercely test me." Bruno violently recoiled. He possessed absolutely zero choice. He walked heavily, completely back, entirely, to his highly prominent table. Camilla loudly, highly annoyingly chirping completely in his ear, entirely about exactly how incredibly rude they absolutely were. But Bruno literally could not actively hear her. He sat heavily down, intensely staring directly at the highly empty chair, exactly where his beautiful future absolutely should have been. He intensely looked directly at Mariana, happily laughing completely with a massive billionaire, heavily carrying a beautiful child who could highly possibly be the absolute heir entirely to exactly 2 massive empires, and entirely for the absolute first time completely in his entire life. Bruno Torres profoundly felt incredibly, pathetically small, but the highly terrifying night was absolutely far, entirely from completely over. Ricardo just threatened to buy Bruno's company. Do you think he will actually do it? Drop your theories below. The lawsuit, the architect of revenge. When Bruno aggressively signaled entirely for the highly expensive check, desperately frantic entirely to safely escape. He vividly saw a highly unassuming man, completely in a highly simple gray suit, confidently approach Ricardo's massive table. It was an official process server. Bruno completely paused. Was Ricardo actively being legally served? The highly unassuming man smoothly walked completely past Ricardo and confidently headed directly straight entirely to Bruno's highly prominent table. "Are you officially Bruno Torres?" the unassuming man politely asked. "Yes." "You have officially been highly legally served," the unassuming man stated, aggressively throwing a highly thick, heavy envelope completely onto the expensive table. Directly right, perfectly, next entirely to the bright red wine stain. Bruno frantically tore the heavy envelope completely open, his massive hands violently trembling. It absolutely wasn't a highly complex lawsuit entirely from Ricardo. It was a highly massive federal lawsuit entirely from Mariana. Plaintiff: Mariana Vargas Cruz. Subject: massive theft entirely of intellectual property. Highly regarding the Torres algorithmic model. Bruno's blood violently turned completely to absolute freezing ice. The highly complex algorithm, the highly brilliant code that had miraculously earned him his absolute first massive billion. The highly brilliant code that he highly arrogantly, falsely, claimed to have successfully written entirely himself. The highly brilliant code that Mariana had actually, successfully, completely written entirely for him, entirely, in their highly tiny college dorm room exactly 10 agonizing years completely ago. She absolutely wasn't entirely just completely back. Entirely for highly pathetic revenge. She was officially back to aggressively take absolutely everything. The ghost writer, the bright morning sun aggressively hit the massive glass walls entirely of Bruno Torres's luxury corner office, but it absolutely brought zero pure warmth. The heavy air completely inside was freezing cold, highly conditioned, completely to a highly sterile chill that flawlessly matched the highly terrifying mood entirely of the exactly 3 massive men sitting heavily completely around the massive mahogany conference table. Bruno sat heavily entirely with his massive head completely in his shaking hands. Directly across, entirely from him, was Dr. Marcelo Fontana, his absolute top, highly elite corporate lawyer, a highly arrogant man who usually expensively charged exactly 2,000 reais, an absolute hour entirely, to simply visually look incredibly bored. But today, he visually looked genuinely, utterly terrified. "Explicitly tell me that this is absolutely a highly pathetic joke, Fontana," Bruno murmured softly, smoothly sliding the massive lawsuit completely across the polished table. She legally majored entirely in simple literature. She highly efficiently proofread my boring emails. She absolutely did not actively write the damn complex code. Fontana nervously adjusted his expensive glasses, thick sweat violently beating completely on his forehead. "Bruno, we urgently asked the highly elite forensic IT team to aggressively analyze the absolute core source code entirely of the massive Torres algorithmic model. The absolute massive foundation entirely of your entire multi-billion-dollar platform. They successfully found absolutely something massive, completely buried entirely deep, completely inside the highly complex kernel. Highly hidden metadata. And," Bruno violently snapped. Fontana aggressively hit exactly one single key, completely on his expensive laptop, seamlessly projecting a highly complex image entirely onto the massive wall screen. It was a highly massive sequence entirely of highly complex code, but flawlessly, completely hidden, highly deeply, completely inside the highly complex syntax, were highly specific, hidden comments. Highly personal notes explicitly written entirely by the highly brilliant programmer directly to Bruno. For exactly when you can finally, peacefully, sleep soundly tonight. With pure love, M. Bruno stared blankly directly at the glowing screen. The massive memory violently hit him, exactly like a highly brutal physical blow. It was exactly 7 agonizing years completely ago. He was actively, entirely about to violently fail his highly critical final exams. His highly flawed code violently crashing absolutely every single time he aggressively ran it. He had violently passed completely out entirely from pure exhaustion, completely on the highly cheap futon. When he finally woke completely up, the highly complex code was flawlessly fixed. Mariana was sitting peacefully, completely there, entirely with a hot cup, entirely of cheap coffee, smiling highly exhaustedly. She smoothly said she simply tinkered completely with it just a tiny bit. He arrogantly assumed she absolutely only successfully fixed a highly simple typo. He absolutely did not fully realize that she had completely, flawlessly rewritten the absolute entire, highly complex architecture. It actively gets significantly worse, Fontana stated, his deep voice violently dropping. The massive lawsuit explicitly alleges that the absolute copyrights entirely to this highly specific architecture were officially, federally registered completely by her entirely under a highly secretive pseudonym, Ghostwriter. Exactly 3 short days, completely before you arrogantly launched. She officially, legally, owns the highly valuable intellectual property, Bruno, and she is actively filing entirely for a highly immediate federal injunction entirely to aggressively shut completely down absolutely all your massive servers completely until a highly massive settlement is successfully reached. Shut us completely down. Bruno violently stood completely up, aggressively knocking his heavy chair completely backward. If the massive servers violently go completely down entirely for exactly 1 short hour, our highly valuable stock violently plummets exactly 10%. If they aggressively go completely down highly indefinitely, Torres Tech completely goes violently bankrupt entirely in exactly 1 short week. Then you desperately need to actively settle, Fontana stated incredibly grimly. Generously give her absolutely whatever the hell she fiercely wants. Massive money, massive shares, a highly public apology. Because if this actually goes completely to federal court, she possesses the highly undeniable digital receipts, and she actively possesses the highly terrifying legal team entirely of Ricardo Vargas, completely behind her. They will absolutely, violently bury us alive. Bruno confidently walked directly to the massive window, intensely staring completely at the massive city he arrogantly thought he completely owned. His expensive phone violently vibrated. It was Camila. Message. Baby! My expensive black card was violently declined completely at Gucci. Aggressively fix this ASAP. Highly important people are actively staring. Bruno violently hurled the expensive phone completely against the hard wall. It violently shattered entirely into 1,000,000 microscopic pieces. He absolutely could not violently lose his massive company. He was Bruno Torres. He was a highly brilliant genius. He absolutely wasn't a highly pathetic fraud who arrogantly piggybacked entirely on his highly brilliant wife's massive success. Where exactly is she? Bruno demanded, violently turning completely back entirely to Fontana. She is officially hosting the massive silver gala exactly tonight entirely at the massive Museum of Modern Art, Fontana rapidly replied. It is a highly exclusive fundraiser entirely for struggling single mothers. The highly elite tickets cost exactly 20,000 reais, exactly 1,000 reais entirely per plate. Aggressively get me exactly one single ticket, Bruno violently ordered. Bruno, if you aggressively approach her, you violently violate the highly strict restraining order. I explicitly said aggressively get me a ticket, Bruno violently roared. I am absolutely not actively going to aggressively harass her. I am actively going to successfully remind her that she fiercely loved me exactly once. Mariana is incredibly soft. She is highly emotional. If I can successfully get her completely alone, entirely away, completely from Vargas, I can successfully convince her. I can successfully make her aggressively drop absolutely all of this. Fontana visually looked incredibly highly doubtful, but he rapidly picked completely up his secure phone. I will desperately try, but Bruno, she absolutely does not visually look incredibly soft anymore. Bruno is going to confront Mariana. Do you think she will forgive him and drop the lawsuit? Tell us your predictions. The Silver Gala, the Queen's Reckoning, the massive Museum of Modern Art was flawlessly transformed completely into a highly stunning winter wonderland, brilliantly shimmering entirely in pure silver and bright white. The absolute highest elite entirely of the massive city, powerful politicians, massive heirs, terrifying tech magnates, smoothly roamed completely through the massive halls. Expensive champagne glasses securely entirely in their hands. Bruno confidently entered completely alone. He absolutely had not actively brought Camila. He desperately needed to vividly appear highly serious, deeply, profoundly remorseful. He flawlessly wore his absolute most highly conservative bespoke suit, but he profoundly felt exactly like a highly pathetic imposter, completely in his absolute own skin. Every single toxic whisper he faintly heard actively seemed to be entirely about him. Did you actively hear entirely about the massive Taurus Tech stock plunge completely today? I explicitly heard that Vargas Global is aggressively acquiring a highly massive stake entirely in a brand new competitor. Bruno aggressively pushed his highly desperate way completely through the massive crowd, his piercing eyes frantically searching completely for the highly beautiful emerald green dress. He absolutely did not vividly see emerald green tonight. He vividly saw brilliant silver. Mariana was confidently standing entirely on a highly elevated platform, entirely in the massive main hall, beautifully speaking directly into a highly clear microphone. She flawlessly wore a highly stunning silver maternity gown that brilliantly shimmered exactly like pure liquid moonlight. She visually looked absolutely majestic, utterly untouchable. A true, absolute queen, flawlessly addressing her highly loyal subjects. And exactly that is exactly why the massive Vargas Foundation is highly proudly pledging exactly 5 million reais entirely for highly elite legal assistance, exclusively for brave women who have been highly unjustly, ruthlessly dispossessed entirely in highly toxic divorce settlements, Mariana stated, her beautiful voice incredibly clear and highly strong. The massive crowd violently erupted entirely into highly enthusiastic applause. Bruno physically felt a highly tight knot entirely of blinding nausea, completely in his heavy stomach. The massive fund was an absolute, highly direct attack completely on him as Mariana gracefully descended, heavily surrounded entirely by highly loyal admirers. Bruno aggressively made his massive move. He rapidly maneuvered completely through the dense crowd, actively ignoring the highly curious looks entirely from wealthy people he had arrogantly snubbed completely in the highly toxic past. "Mariana," he softly called completely out. Exactly just as she was actively about to be securely whisked completely away entirely by her massive security detail, she completely, abruptly stopped. The massive crowd completely around them flawlessly parted, deeply sensing the highly explosive drama. This was the highly anticipated confrontation that absolutely everyone was actively, toxically gossiping entirely about. Mariana slowly, highly elegantly, turned completely around. Ricardo was absolutely not securely by her beautiful side, entirely, for the absolute first time. He was completely on the absolute other side entirely of the massive room, actively speaking entirely with a highly powerful senator. This was Bruno's absolute, massive chance. "Bruno," she stated, her beautiful expression utterly, completely unreadable. "You successfully bought an expensive ticket? That is incredibly generous. I highly safely assume the massive 20,000 reais is a highly pathetic advance entirely on the massive alimony you absolutely still legally owe me." The highly public use entirely of the heavy word alimony actively made a highly few elite people nearby laugh incredibly softly. Bruno aggressively took exactly one massive step closer, violently lowering his deep voice completely to a highly desperate whisper. "Mariana, please. We desperately need to actively talk highly privately. I possess absolutely nothing to explicitly say completely to you that absolutely cannot be explicitly stated directly in front entirely of a federal judge," she coldly replied. "It is entirely about the massive company," Bruno pathetically pleaded. "You are actively going to violently destroy it. Do you possess absolutely any idea exactly how incredibly many innocent people will violently lose their absolute jobs? I profoundly know you are violently angry completely with me, but do absolutely not take it completely out entirely on my innocent employees. That absolutely isn't exactly who you truly are. You are incredibly kind. You are the beautiful woman who lovingly saved pathetic stray cats." Mariana's piercing eyes brilliantly flashed. The beautiful woman who lovingly saved pathetic stray cats violently died, entirely on the horrific night she actively slept completely in her freezing car, entirely because her highly toxic husband maliciously canceled absolutely all her credit cards. The massive crowd violently gasped. Bruno completely, violently paled. He desperately hoped absolutely no one completely knew entirely about that highly toxic detail. "I absolutely didn't explicitly know you possessed absolutely nowhere to actively go," he pathetically stammered. "I genuinely thought you had safely gone completely to your parents. My loving parents are completely dead, Bruno. You profoundly knew that. You simply absolutely did not fiercely care." She confidently took exactly one massive step, significantly closer completely to him, her beautiful voice violently dropping completely to a highly lethal whisper. "And exactly regarding your massive company, it absolutely isn't your massive company. It is flawlessly built completely on my highly complex code, my highly agonizing sleepless nights, my pure, unadulterated genius. You were absolutely just the highly pathetic, arrogant face, Bruno. And exactly now, I am violently ripping that highly toxic mask completely off." "Mariana, wait," Bruno stated, desperately attempting to aggressively grab her soft hand. "And exactly what about the beautiful baby? If you violently destroy me, you violently destroy his massive inheritance. That beautiful child, he is absolutely mine, isn't he? Deep, completely down. You profoundly know he desperately needs his true father." Mariana intensely looked directly at Bruno's massive hand, entirely on her soft arm, then completely back directly at his highly desperate face. She absolutely did not violently pull completely away. She simply smiled, but it was a highly freezing smile that absolutely did not successfully reach her beautiful eyes. "You genuinely, desperately want to explicitly know entirely about the beautiful baby Bruno?" "Yes," he heavily breathed, arrogantly thinking he had successfully found a highly massive opening. "I legally possess the absolute right to explicitly know." "Okay," she stated, her beautiful voice incredibly loud, entirely enough completely for the highly curious inner circle to flawlessly hear. "On the highly horrific night you violently kicked me completely out. I securely had a highly small gift box entirely in my soft hand. Do you vividly remember?" Bruno deeply frowned, actively thinking completely back entirely to the highly toxic past. Yes, she was actively holding a highly small, pristine white box. He had violently knocked it completely out entirely of her soft hand, entirely in his highly toxic rush, to aggressively get her completely out the heavy door, entirely so Camila could actively come completely over. "I vividly remember," he whispered incredibly softly. Securely inside that highly small box was a highly positive pregnancy test and a highly adorable pair, entirely of incredibly tiny baby shoes, Mariana stated, her beautiful voice violently trembling slightly completely, with highly suppressed, pure rage. "I desperately tried to explicitly tell you. I desperately tried to softly say, Bruno, we are actively going to possess a beautiful family. And you intensely looked directly at me and cruelly said, aggressively grab your pathetic trash and completely leave." Bruno physically felt absolutely all the blood violently drain completely from his handsome face. The massive room violently spun. "So do absolutely not confidently stand perfectly here and toxically pretend that you fiercely care entirely about true fatherhood," Mariana violently hissed. "You ruthlessly abandoned your biological son completely before he was absolutely even born. And exactly now, he officially possesses a true father. A highly genuine, true man who fiercely held me completely while I violently cried. Who actively went entirely to absolutely every single medical ultrasound. Who meticulously assembled the beautiful nursery completely with his absolute own bare hands. It absolutely isn't exactly the same," Bruno pathetically argued incredibly weakly. "Absolute biology massively matters. Absolute biology actively makes you a highly pathetic donor, Bruno. Pure, unconditional love actively makes you a true father." The adoption suddenly. A highly massive, heavy hand aggressively landed completely on Bruno's broad shoulder. It was Ricardo Vargas. He had seamlessly, rapidly crossed the massive room entirely in mere seconds. "Is there absolutely any massive problem completely here?" Ricardo calmly asked. His deep voice highly calm, but terrifyingly, incredibly deep. "We are absolutely just actively talking," Bruno stated, desperately attempting to aggressively shake the massive hand completely off his shoulder. He absolutely could not. Ricardo's massive grip was exactly like solid iron. "It visually seemed exactly as if you were highly aggressively disturbing my beautiful wife," Ricardo stated. "She is absolutely not your beautiful wife yet." Bruno spat violently, his highly toxic jealousy violently exploding completely again. Ricardo smiled radiantly. He smoothly reached entirely into his expensive coat pocket and flawlessly pulled completely out a highly folded piece entirely of thick paper. He aggressively shoved it completely into the breast pocket entirely of Bruno's highly expensive jacket. "Carefully read that, exactly when you confidently leave. It is a highly official copy entirely of the massive adoption papers. I officially, legally, adopted the beautiful child entirely in the womb, exactly 2 agonizing weeks, completely ago. Completely with Mariana's absolute, full consent. And the stern federal court's absolute, highly expedited approval, entirely due completely to the highly documented, highly proven absolute abandonment, entirely by the pathetic biological progenitor. Bruno stared blankly directly at him, his arrogant mouth completely wide open. You absolutely cannot legally do that. I am officially Ricardo Vargas, he stated incredibly simply. I can successfully do absolutely anything. Now get the hell completely out entirely of my massive sight completely before I actively ask my elite security to violently throw you completely down the massive staircase, highly humiliated, completely defeated, and entirely with the highly judgmental eyes, entirely of the absolute Sao Paulo elite violently burning completely into his broad back. Bruno abruptly turned and frantically fled. He violently stumbled completely out, entirely into the highly freezing night air, completely outside the massive museum. He frantically reached completely into his deep pocket and violently pulled completely out the heavy paper that Ricardo had aggressively given him. They absolutely weren't entirely just highly official adoption papers. There was a highly official federal DNA test result securely attached completely to the back. Subject, Bruno Torres. Result, 0% probability of paternity. Bruno completely froze. He read it completely again. 0%. He frantically scanned the highly official document. Then, he vividly saw the highly specific medical note completely at the absolute bottom. Note: the highly tested subject possesses a highly rare, congenital condition that permanently renders him completely, irreversibly sterile. Condition highly likely present entirely since early adolescence. Bruno violently dropped the heavy paper completely onto the freezing sidewalk. He absolutely wasn't the biological father. He had absolutely never, ever been the biological father. He absolutely could not be a father. But if he was completely sterile and Mariana was heavily pregnant, then exactly who was the biological father? And then, the massive, horrifying realization violently hit him. The highly exact timeline. The highly frequent business trips that Mariana had actively taken completely alone. Exactly 1 agonizing year completely ago directly to California. Exactly where the massive global headquarters entirely of Vargas Global was actively located. She absolutely hadn't entirely just miraculously met Ricardo exactly 6 agonizing months completely ago. She had intimately known him completely from highly significantly before. Bruno just found out he is completely sterile. What do you think he will do with this massive realization? Tell us below. The revelation of truth. The freezing rain entirely in Sao Paulo absolutely did not magically wash highly toxic things completely away. It simply, actively made the highly disgusting dirt significantly more incredibly slippery. Bruno stood completely frozen, entirely on the freezing sidewalk, completely outside the highly elite, specialized fertility clinic entirely in the Jardins district. The highly heavy, solid oak door violently closing completely behind him, entirely, with a highly terrifying finality that violently echoed completely in his very bones. He had aggressively gone directly there, violently, demanding absolute answers. Highly aggressively threatening to legally sue the massive clinic completely for massive malpractice. Violently screaming that the highly official DNA test that Ricardo had aggressively given him was an absolute, highly toxic fake. The elite doctor, a highly respected, elderly man, completely with absolutely zero pathetic patience, entirely for highly arrogant billionaires throwing massive tantrums. Simply, flawlessly pulled completely out Bruno's highly confidential medical file, completely from exactly 20 agonizing years entirely ago. A highly detailed file, entirely from exactly when Bruno was violently hospitalized, completely for a highly severe case, entirely of complex mumps, complications entirely in his early adolescence. I explicitly told your loving parents entirely at the highly specific time, Mr. Torres. The elite doctor had firmly stated, meticulously adjusting his expensive glasses. The massive catastrophic damage was completely, utterly total. You absolutely have never, ever been biologically capable entirely of successfully fathering biological children. We safely, confidently assumed you completely knew. Bruno walked highly blindly, completely through the freezing rain. His highly expensive Italian leather shoes loudly splashing completely in the freezing puddles. He absolutely did not know. Or perhaps, completely, incredibly deep, completely down. He had highly arrogantly, toxically ignored absolutely all the highly obvious signs. For exactly 5 agonizing years, he had aggressively, highly toxically blamed Mariana. Every single agonizing month that her highly regular period arrived, he aggressively sighed heavily, intensely looked directly at her completely with massive, toxic disappointment, and highly maliciously made a highly subtle, toxic comment entirely about her highly ticking biological clock. He aggressively, highly toxically made her physically feel completely, utterly broken. He highly aggressively sent her directly to elite specialists, violently forced her to actively take highly complex hormones that violently made her incredibly sick, and highly toxically shamed her completely when absolutely nothing miraculously happened. And the absolute, entire time, the highly broken one was absolutely him. He frantically hailed a cheap taxi, his massive hands violently trembling. He desperately needed to actively go completely home. He desperately needed to actively explain entirely to Camilla that Camilla. The massive, horrifying realization violently hit him. Camilla was absolutely only actively with him entirely because he had highly arrogantly promised her the entire massive world. He had highly toxically promised her a massive dynasty. If she horrifyingly discovered that he was completely sterile, and that his massive, multi-billion-dollar company was actively on the absolute terrifying brink entirely of catastrophic collapse, she would permanently disappear completely before the highly early morning news. He smoothly arrived entirely at his massive penthouse, completely soaked. The luxury place was an absolute chaotic mess. There were highly expensive shopping bags absolutely everywhere. Chanel, Hermes, Prada. Camila was sitting heavily entirely on the expensive sofa, heavily surrounded entirely by highly open boxes, violently screaming completely into her expensive phone. I absolutely do not fiercely care entirely if the highly expensive card was violently declined. Aggressively swipe it completely again. Do you absolutely know exactly who my highly powerful boyfriend is? She slowly looked completely up, exactly when Bruno confidently entered. Freezing water aggressively dripping completely onto the pristine marble floor. Ugh! Finally, Bruno. Aggressively fix my highly expensive black card. It is actively embarrassing me incredibly. Bruno intensely looked directly at her. Genuinely, truly looked entirely at her. She was incredibly beautiful, yes. But it was a highly plastic, incredibly hollow beauty. There was absolutely zero pure warmth entirely in her vacant eyes. Only absolute, pure hunger. Camilla, he stated, his deep voice incredibly hoarse. "Rapidly pack your cheap bags." She laughed loudly, a highly sharp, incredibly brittle sound. "Excuse me? Are we actively going directly to Paris?" "No," Bruno stated, confidently walking completely over and aggressively kicking a highly expensive Chanel box completely across the massive room. "You are actively leaving. Get the hell out." Camilla violently stood completely up, her beautiful face violently twisting completely into a highly ugly sneer. "You absolutely cannot highly possibly be serious. Do you honestly, arrogantly, think you can simply violently throw me completely away, exactly like you toxically did completely with your highly pathetic ex-wife?" "My beautiful ex-wife," Bruno violently stated, the heavy words violently tearing completely from his dry throat, "was absolutely worth exactly 10 entirely of you. She beautifully, flawlessly built me. You absolutely only aggressively bleed me completely dry. Get the hell out, Camilla. I am completely, permanently finished, actively paying entirely for your highly pathetic company." "Fine!" she violently screamed, aggressively snatching a highly massive handful entirely of expensive jewelry completely from the small table. "You are incredibly boring anyway, and entirely for the absolute record, Bruno, absolutely everyone is actively laughing entirely at you. You arrogantly think you are a massive king, but you are absolutely just a highly pathetic walking wallet. And I explicitly heard entirely about the massive lawsuit. You are actively going to be completely poor, Bruno. And poor absolutely does not flawlessly suit you." She violently stormed completely out, aggressively slamming the heavy door so incredibly hard that the highly thick walls violently shook. Bruno was completely, utterly alone. He smoothly poured himself an expensive drink, intensely staring completely out at the bright city lights. He had violently destroyed his beautiful marriage entirely for a highly toxic woman who absolutely did not fiercely love him. He had permanently lost the absolute, only beautiful person who had ever truly, genuinely believed entirely in him. But then, the massive sadness violently mutated completely into absolutely something significantly darker. A highly cold, incredibly malignant rage aggressively began to violently surge. Mariana profoundly knew. She absolutely had to completely know. If she was heavily pregnant exactly now, and the beautiful baby absolutely wasn't completely his, and he was completely sterile, that explicitly meant she had actively, violently cheated. The highly exact timeline violently tormented him. Divorced exactly 6 agonizing months. Pregnant exactly 7 agonizing months. She had actively slept completely with absolutely someone entirely, while they were absolutely still legally married. Bruno laughed loudly, a highly low, incredibly manic sound. Saint Mariana, the highly beautiful woman who toxically pretended to be so incredibly, flawlessly perfect. She was an absolute, pathetic adulteress. Hitomwa aggressively grabbed his expensive phone. He rapidly dialed a highly specific number he had absolutely not actively used entirely in agonizing years. A highly sleazy, toxic tabloid journalist explicitly named Beto, who legally owed him a highly massive favor. "Beto," Bruno stated, his deep voice incredibly smooth and highly dangerous. "I possess a highly massive scoop completely for you. The absolute true story, completely behind the highly romantic romance entirely of Ricardo Vargas and Mariana Cruz. Exactly how the massive billionaire highly maliciously stole absolutely another man's beautiful wife. And exactly how Saint Mariana was heavily carrying a highly pathetic bastard child entirely while absolutely still sleeping completely in her highly loyal husband's bed. "That is absolute, explosive dynamite, Bruno," Beto stated, practically actively salivating. "But can you flawlessly prove the highly exact timeline?" "The beautiful baby is the absolute, undeniable proof." Bruno completely lied. "Aggressively publish it. Violently burn her pristine reputation completely to the hard ground. If she desperately wants to legally sue me entirely for my massive company, I will fiercely ensure that she is way too incredibly ashamed to absolutely ever aggressively show her beautiful face completely in federal court." Bruno violently hung completely up. He profoundly felt a highly twisted, toxic sensation entirely of pure victory. If he was actively going to violently fall completely down, he would aggressively drag absolutely everyone completely down, entirely into hell, entirely with him. The Checkmate broadcast, the highly explosive headline the absolute next morning, was incredibly brutal. "Billionaire baby scandal. Ricardo Vargas maliciously stole his heavily pregnant mistress entirely from a highly heartbroken husband." The highly toxic article aggressively painted Bruno entirely as the absolute, pathetic victim. A highly hard-working, loyal husband, violently caught completely off guard, entirely by a highly toxic, cheating wife, who maliciously seduced a significantly wealthier man entirely to aggressively climb the highly elite social ladder. It highly maliciously insinuated that the beautiful baby was the absolute product entirely of a highly illicit affair and actively conducted entirely in Bruno's absolute own house. Bruno sat heavily entirely in his massive office, intensely watching the highly explosive storm completely on social media. Public opinion was violently shifting. Highly toxic people were actively calling Mariana a pathetic gold digger. They were highly aggressively questioning the absolute integrity entirely of Ricardo Vargas. "This will actively force a highly massive settlement," Bruno confidently stated to Dr. Fontana, who visually looked incredibly pale. "They are actively going to aggressively drop the massive lawsuit completely to successfully make the highly toxic bad press completely disappear." "Bruno," Fontana stated, intensely looking directly at his glowing tablet, "you desperately need to aggressively see this. Vargas Global literally just urgently called a highly massive press conference. They are actively broadcasting completely live." Bruno aggressively spun his expensive chair completely toward the massive, giant screen entirely on the wall. Exactly there was Ricardo Vargas confidently standing perfectly at a highly imposing podium. He absolutely did not look highly shaken. He absolutely did not look violently angry. He visually looked exactly like a highly terrifying executioner. Right directly beside him was Mariana. She absolutely wasn't cowardly hiding. She intensely looked directly entirely at the highly clear camera lens, her beautiful expression highly fierce. "This bright morning," Ricardo confidently began, his deep voice powerfully echoing completely through the massive speakers. "A highly desperate, pathetic man aggressively attempted to toxically use the massive media entirely to violently bully a heavily pregnant woman. Bruno Torres highly falsely accused my beautiful fiancée entirely of toxic infidelity. He maliciously accused me entirely of violently destroying a highly happy home." Ricardo violently paused, then looked intensely, directly entirely into the massive lens. "We flawlessly anticipated exactly this, because highly toxic liars absolutely always arrogantly assume that absolutely everyone completely else is actively lying." Ricardo smoothly took exactly one highly brief step completely to the side, and Mariana confidently took the heavy microphone. "I absolutely did not violently cheat entirely on Bruno Torres. she stated incredibly clearly. I was a highly faithful, incredibly loyal wife, entirely for exactly 7 agonizing years. I fiercely supported him exactly when we possessed absolute nothing. I brilliantly wrote the highly complex code that miraculously made him a massive billionaire entirely while he peacefully slept. She confidently held completely up a highly official document. This is a highly official medical report, completely from a highly renowned elite clinic, explicitly dated exactly 8 agonizing months, completely ago. Exactly 1 short month, completely before Bruno violently divorced me. It flawlessly confirms that I successfully underwent exactly 1 singular round entirely of highly advanced IVF treatment, completely utilizing an elite sperm donor. Bruno completely, utterly froze IVF. I fiercely did this, Mariana aggressively continued, her beautiful voice violently trembling incredibly slightly. Because my arrogant husband was highly, incredibly desperate, entirely for a massive heir, but highly toxically refused to actively consult an elite doctor entirely himself. I desperately wanted to beautifully surprise him. I desperately wanted to beautifully give him the massive family he explicitly claimed he desperately wanted. I completely paid entirely for absolutely all of it, completely with my absolute own personal savings. I bravely went completely through the highly painful injections, completely alone. A highly heavy, absolute silence violently fell completely over the massive room entirely on the video, and entirely over Bruno's freezing office. I horrifyingly discovered that the highly complex procedure was flawlessly successful entirely on the exact day that Bruno aggressively handed me the highly toxic divorce papers, Mariana stated. A single, highly hot tear finally gracefully escaping. I desperately tried to explicitly tell him. He absolutely refused to actively listen. He violently kicked me completely out. I was heavily pregnant, completely homeless, and utterly, completely alone. That is exactly when Ricardo Vargas miraculously found me. He absolutely did not maliciously steal me, Bruno. You ruthlessly, violently threw me completely away. He simply beautifully picked completely up the highly priceless treasure that you were way too incredibly, arrogantly blind to clearly see. Ricardo confidently stepped completely back entirely to the heavy microphone. As entirely for the massive business. Mr. Torres highly apparently seems to have completely, conveniently forgotten absolutely something highly massive entirely about the ghostwriter architecture he maliciously stole. Bruno's heavy stomach violently dropped. Mariana absolutely did not entirely just brilliantly write the highly complex code. Ricardo stated completely, with a highly dark, terrifying smile. She flawlessly protected it. There is a highly advanced, massive security mechanism perfectly built directly into the absolute kernel. A highly lethal kill switch. It was flawlessly designed to violently trigger exactly if an absolute unauthorized user, Bruno, aggressively attempted to violently tamper completely with the highly critical core files, which, completely according entirely to our highly advanced records, your elite IT team actively did this exact morning entirely in a highly desperate attempt to violently hide the highly undeniable evidence entirely of the massive theft. Ricardo smoothly looked directly at his expensive watch. The highly lethal switch actively engages entirely in exactly 3, 2, 1. In Bruno's massive office, the bright lights violently flickered. Then, the highly constant, massive hum entirely of the highly expensive servers, entirely in the towering building, completely died. Bruno's massive computer screen violently went completely pitch black. "Sir!" His elite assistant violently burst completely into the massive room, highly hysterical. The entire massive platform is completely down. The complex app is completely down. Absolutely everything is completely offline. The highly complex code, it is simply completely gone. It is actively, violently deleting itself. Bruno frantically, aggressively slammed his massive hands completely on his expensive keyboard. Absolutely nothing. Just a highly blank, pitch-black screen, completely with highly toxic green text, brilliantly flashing entirely in the absolute corner. Fatal error, unauthorized user, goodbye Bruno, on the massive TV screen. Ricardo Vargas confidently leaned incredibly close completely to the heavy microphone. Torres Tech is exactly now effectively a highly empty shell company, completely with absolutely zero massive assets. The highly valuable stock is currently actively in absolute, terrifying freefall. I have absolutely already formally contacted the official SEC entirely to legally hand completely over highly undeniable evidence entirely of Bruno Torres's massive embezzlement, entirely of highly lucrative corporate funds, perfectly to actively pay entirely for his pathetic mistress's highly expensive lifestyle. Ricardo's piercing eyes were exactly as freezing cold as absolute ice. Checkmate, Bruno. The live broadcast abruptly cut completely off. Bruno sat heavily, completely in the absolute silence, entirely, of his completely dead, massive office. His expensive phone aggressively began to violently ring. It was the elite board of directors, then the official SEC, then the massive bank. He absolutely did not actively answer. He confidently walked directly to the massive, floor-to-ceiling window and intensely looked completely out, entirely at the busy streets, entirely of Sao Paulo. He desperately wanted to aggressively be an absolute king. He desperately wanted to be violently feared. He had successfully gotten his highly toxic wish. He was exactly now violently feared, exactly as a highly pathetic, catastrophic cautionary tale. He too intensely watched exactly as a massive black SUV smoothly pulled directly up entirely to the busy curb, incredibly far completely below. He vividly saw a highly small, beautiful figure entirely in a green coat, gracefully step completely into the luxury car, beautifully helped completely by a highly tall, powerful man. Even completely from this massive, incredible distance, he could vividly see the highly pure, absolute care entirely in the powerful man's gentle gesture. Mariana. She had miraculously, flawlessly won. She absolutely hadn't entirely just violently defeated him. She had completely, utterly erased him. Bruno heavily sank completely to the hard floor. The highly deafening silence entirely of the massive, empty office, violently pressing completely down entirely on him, exactly like a highly crushing physical weight. He slowly reached completely into his deep pocket and gently pulled completely out the highly old, crumpled photograph he had fiercely kept completely in his expensive wallet, entirely for agonizing years. A beautiful photo entirely of him and Mariana, entirely in the tiny college dorm, happily eating cheap pizza completely on the hard floor, laughing incredibly loudly. They were incredibly, pathetically poor, but he visually looked incredibly, flawlessly happy. He profoundly realized exactly now, completely with the massive, crushing weight entirely of absolute, total ruin, that exactly that highly specific moment had been the absolute wealthiest he had absolutely ever genuinely been. And he had ruthlessly traded absolutely all of it completely for a highly fake diamond chandelier that absolutely wasn't even miraculously real. Bruno lost everything, and Mariana won. Do you think he got the karma he deserved? Share your final thoughts below. The Fallen King. Exactly 3 agonizing years is an incredibly, highly massive amount, entirely of time, completely in the highly ruthless business world. Entirely in exactly 3 short years, highly ambitious startups violently rise. Massive empires catastrophically fall. And highly prominent names that once aggressively dominated the massive headlines are ruthlessly swept completely into the highly toxic dustbin entirely of forgotten history, but entirely for Bruno Torres. Exactly 3 agonizing years physically felt exactly like exactly 3 entire agonizing centuries. The catastrophic fall absolutely hadn't been incredibly swift. It absolutely hadn't been the highly clean, incredibly rapid execution he had toxically expected, exactly when his massive computer screen violently went completely pitch black. It was a highly slow, incredibly agonizing, massive dismantling. The highly official SEC federal investigation aggressively dragged completely on, entirely for exactly 18 agonizing months. A highly public, brutal flaying that ruthlessly stripped him completely of absolutely every single pathetic layer entirely of basic dignity he previously possessed. They aggressively took the luxury penthouse absolutely first. Then, the massive exotic cars. Then, the highly priceless elite art collection. He vividly remembered the exact horrific day the official bailiffs violently came entirely for his highly prized, massive watch collection. He stood completely frozen there, intensely watching a highly pathetic man, completely in a highly cheap jacket, carelessly handle his highly expensive Patek Philippe, the exact specific one he arrogantly bought exactly when he successfully made his absolute first 10 million, and casually toss it completely into a cheap evidence bag, exactly as if it were absolutely nothing more than a highly pathetic plastic toy. That was the exact, highly specific moment exactly when Camilla violently left. She absolutely didn't even gracefully pack a cheap bag. She simply called a cheap Uber, intensely looked directly at him completely, with eyes utterly devoid entirely of absolutely anything remotely resembling pure love, and stated, "You are absolutely terrible entirely for my elite brand, Bruno." Now, exactly 3 agonizing years significantly later, Bruno violently shivered entirely on the freezing sidewalk, completely outside a massive, grand luxury hotel, entirely in Sao Paulo. The highly freezing, incredibly damp wind, entirely of the bitter winter night, was an absolute, violent physical assault. Aggressively biting completely through the highly thin, cheap fabric entirely of his highly pathetic polyester uniform. He was absolutely no longer Bruno Torres, the terrifying massive tech magnate. He was exactly now Julio, the highly pathetic valet, entirely at the absolute microscopic bottom entirely of the highly toxic hierarchy, completely at the Grand Plaza Hotel. "Hey Julio, wake the hell completely up!" The loud shout aggressively came completely from Manet, the highly arrogant 20-year-old valet captain, who aggressively spent the absolute vast majority entirely of his highly boring shift actively smoking cheap vape and mindlessly checking highly toxic TikTok. Manet had absolutely zero microscopic idea exactly who Bruno arrogantly used to be. Entirely to Manet, Bruno was absolutely just the highly quiet, incredibly pathetic, gray-haired older guy who was way too incredibly slow, entirely on the run, and way too violently trembling completely with the expensive keys. "I am completely awake," Bruno murmured softly, aggressively stamping his freezing feet, desperately trying to magically regain absolute feeling completely in his frozen toes. His highly cheap black shoes were actively leaking. The highly toxic street slush had completely soaked his cheap socks agonizing hours completely ago. Highly massive night exactly tonight, Mane stated, aggressively blowing a highly thick cloud entirely of toxic strawberry-scented smoke completely into Bruno's exhausted face. The highly elite future of technology gala. We possess massive VIPs aggressively coming completely out entirely of our ears. Do absolutely not actively scratch absolutely anything, old man. Those massive cars cost significantly more than your entire pathetic life. Bruno violently flinched. The future of technology gala. Exactly 5 agonizing years completely ago, he had officially been the highly celebrated, absolute keynote speaker entirely at this exact, highly specific event. He vividly remembered the highly deafening applause. He vividly remembered the exact feeling entirely of the incredibly hot, blindingly bright spotlight, exactly as he arrogantly pontificated entirely about massive vision and elite disruption. He vividly remembered Mariana peacefully sitting entirely in the absolute front row, her soft hands gently crossed perfectly over her lap, intensely looking directly at him completely with a highly pure, massive pride that he absolutely did not fiercely deserve. She had flawlessly worn a highly simple, elegant blue dress that exact night, entirely because he had toxically told her that the highly expensive designer dress she desperately wanted was way too incredibly flashy. Tonight, he absolutely wasn't the elite speaker. He was the highly pathetic servant. The heavy hotel doors smoothly opened, beautifully spilling warm, golden light, and the highly soft sound entirely of elegant jazz completely onto the freezing, wet sidewalk. The highly intoxicating smell entirely of expensive perfume and deliciously roasted meats beautifully wafted completely out. A highly cruel, massive reminder entirely of the highly painful hunger actively gnawing completely at Bruno's empty stomach. He had completely skipped cheap lunch entirely to desperately save exactly 5 reais completely for his highly overdue electricity bill. The highly elite guests aggressively began to confidently exit. Bruno vividly recognized highly familiar faces. Exactly there was Dr. Fontana, his highly arrogant former elite lawyer, loudly laughing completely with a highly wealthy, brand-new client. Fontana intensely looked completely, utterly through Bruno exactly as he aggressively handed completely over the cheap valet stub entirely for a massive Mercedes. Bruno gently took the cheap ticket completely with his heavy head, deeply bowed, completely down. The cheap brim entirely of his pathetic cap flawlessly hiding his exhausted eyes. He frantically fetched the expensive car, silently accepted a highly pathetic 5 reais tip completely without a single word, and intensely watched Fontana confidently drive completely away. It was a highly special, terrifying kind, entirely of absolute hell, to be completely, utterly invisible, entirely in a massive world exactly where you arrogantly used to be an absolute, untouchable god. "Pay intense attention," Mane violently hissed, aggressively straightening his cheap jacket. "We officially possess a massive whale confidently arriving. Highly elite, private driver. Massive, fully armored Escalade. It is officially the massive Vargas team." Vargas. The heavy name violently hit Bruno exactly like a highly lethal taser. His heavy breath violently caught entirely in his dry throat. He desperately wanted to frantically run. He desperately wanted to pathetically fake a massive heart attack, aggressively retreat completely to the pathetic break room, violently dissolve completely into the hard concrete. absolutely anything, highly else entirely. But to actively be exactly right here. But he literally could not actively move. His freezing feet were completely, permanently frozen, completely, to the hard sidewalk. Deeply rooted entirely by a highly complex mixture, entirely of absolute terror, and a highly sickening, massive, masochistic curiosity. The massive, highly armored black SUV smoothly pulled directly up completely to the curb, heavily flanked entirely by exactly 2 highly intimidating security vehicles. It absolutely did not visually look exactly like a highly expensive car. It visually looked exactly like an impenetrable, massive fortress, completely on wheels. The massive engine beautifully hummed, completely with a highly low, incredibly powerful vibration that violently rattled Bruno's chattering teeth. "Julio, aggressively get the heavy door," Monet violently barked. Way too incredibly busy, aggressively flirting completely with a highly pathetic socialite, entirely in a fake fur coat. Bruno slowly, highly agonizingly, took exactly 1 step completely forward. His freezing hands violently trembled so incredibly much that he actively had to aggressively clasp them completely behind his back, entirely, for exactly 1 highly brief moment. Desperately trying to magically steady them, he cautiously approached the massive rear passenger door. He vividly saw his absolute own, highly pathetic reflection completely in the heavily tinted glass. A highly gaunt, incredibly hollow-cheeked man, completely with highly unkempt, graying stubble and exhausted eyes that visually looked incredibly haunted. He physically looked exactly 20. Agonizing years, significantly older than his highly actual 35 years. He slowly reached completely out and aggressively pulled the heavy, highly armored handle. The heavy door smoothly opened, and massive, beautiful warmth beautifully poured completely out. The highly intoxicating smell, entirely of expensive leather, rich cedar wood, and highly fresh jasmine. The absolute first massive thing he vividly saw was a highly expensive shoe. A flawlessly polished, handmade Italian Oxford. Ricardo Vargas confidently stepped completely out. Time had absolutely been incredibly, beautifully kind, entirely to Ricardo. If absolutely anything, the agonizing years had absolutely only flawlessly added completely to his highly terrifying, massive presence. He was significantly broader. His distinguished silver hair flawlessly cut entirely in a highly sharp military style. He confidently moved completely with the highly easy, absolute grace entirely of a terrifying man who completely, utterly owned the absolute ground he confidently stepped entirely upon. He absolutely did not actively look entirely at the pathetic valet. He smoothly turned completely back directly to the massive car, gracefully extending his massive hand. "Be incredibly careful, my beautiful love. It is highly slippery." A highly soft hand gently took his. It was an incredibly beautiful hand that Bruno profoundly knew significantly better than his absolute own. He intimately knew the exact shape entirely of the delicate fingers, the beautiful curve entirely of the soft wrist. He profoundly knew exactly how that highly soft hand physically felt, exactly when it lovingly smoothed his dark hair, exactly when he was violently sick. He intimately knew exactly how it physically felt, exactly when it aggressively scrubbed cheap dishes entirely in their absolute first, highly tiny, pathetic apartment. Mariana gracefully stepped completely out. Bruno physically felt absolutely all the heavy air violently rush completely out, entirely of his burning lungs. She was absolutely, undeniably magnificent. The highly timid, pathetic little mouse had completely, permanently vanished. The highly confident woman actively standing perfectly before him was an absolute, untouchable queen. She flawlessly wore a highly stunning, deep crimson velvet designer gown that beautifully hugged her incredible figure, flawlessly topped completely with a highly pristine white coat that visually looked exactly like highly soft, fresh snow. Her beautiful hair was flawlessly styled entirely in highly glamorous, loose waves, and highly expensive, massive diamonds brilliantly sparkled entirely at her beautiful throat. Absolutely not the highly gaudy, highly flashy kind that Camila arrogantly used to constantly demand, but incredibly elegant, highly timeless, beautiful stones. But it absolutely wasn't the highly expensive clothes. It was her beautiful face. The deep worry lines that had highly toxically defined her completely during their toxic marriage had completely, permanently vanished. Flawlessly replaced completely by a highly serene, absolute calm that actively made her beautifully glow. She visually looked incredibly rested. She visually looked highly, profoundly loved. "Wait entirely for me," a highly tiny, beautiful voice happily chirped completely from deeply inside the massive car. Bruno completely, utterly froze. A highly energetic, beautiful little boy, entirely of absolutely no more than exactly 3 years old, happily scurried completely to the absolute edge entirely of the expensive seat. He was flawlessly bundled completely up, entirely, in a highly adorable, miniature navy blue coat and a bright red scarf. He possessed highly dark, beautiful curly hair and incredibly bright, highly curious eyes that enthusiastically scanned the massive world completely with pure, unadulterated wonder. Ricardo laughed loudly. A highly deep, incredibly booming, massive sound that Bruno had absolutely never, ever clearly heard actively directed completely at him. "We absolutely didn't completely forget you, Leo. Come completely here, my little champion." Ricardo smoothly, effortlessly scooped the beautiful boy completely up, highly comfortably, settling him perfectly on his massive hip. The tiny boy laughed loudly, enthusiastically wrapping his incredibly tiny arms completely around Ricardo's massive neck. "Did you vividly see the massive robot, Daddy?" the tiny boy enthusiastically asked. "The highly cool one completely with the bright lasers?" "I absolutely did," Ricardo beautifully replied, lovingly kissing the absolute top entirely of the boy's dark head. "But I highly genuinely think you actively enjoyed the massive dessert table significantly more. I fiercely love sweet cookies," Leo solemnly declared. Mariana laughed beautifully, gently brushing a tiny snowflake completely off the boy's tiny nose. "You are absolutely, undeniably, your true father's biological son. A highly massive sweet tooth and a highly keen eye, entirely for bright lasers. Exactly your true father's son." The heavy words violently echoed entirely in Bruno's empty head, violently ricocheting completely in the highly empty, dark cavern entirely of his pathetic soul. His true father's son. Leo was absolutely not Bruno's. He could absolutely never, ever, possibly be Bruno's. The highly official DNA test had absolutely been the highly final, massive nail, entirely in the highly toxic coffin, entirely of Bruno's pathetic ego. He was completely, irreversibly sterile. He was an absolute, highly pathetic genetic dead end. Absolutely all his highly arrogant, toxic talk, entirely about a massive legacy, entirely about a massive dynasty, entirely about the highly arrogant Torres name. Absolutely all of it had been an absolute, highly pathetic sham. The absolute, true massive legacy was actively right perfectly in front, entirely of him. A highly happy, incredibly healthy, beautiful child. Beautifully raised completely by a highly true man who absolutely did not desperately need to toxically demand massive respect to fiercely earn it. Bruno remained standing perfectly still, entirely by the heavy open door. Completely, utterly paralyzed. He profoundly knew he absolutely should aggressively close it. He profoundly knew he absolutely should cowardly step completely back, violently disappear completely into the dark shadows. But he literally could not violently tear his piercing eyes completely away entirely from the beautiful boy. Leo possessed Mariana's beautiful nose. He possessed Mariana's beautiful smile. Suddenly, the tiny boy slowly looked directly at him. Leo's highly innocent eyes fiercely locked entirely on Bruno. The innocent child absolutely did not vividly see a highly pathetic failure. He absolutely did not vividly see a highly bankrupt, massive fraud. He simply vividly saw a highly quiet man, completely with a highly funny hat, standing perfectly still entirely in the freezing cold rain. "Hi," Leo stated incredibly softly, happily giving a highly tiny, friendly wave completely with exactly one highly gloved, soft hand. The highly pure sound entirely of the innocent boy's beautiful voice completely, violently shattered absolutely all of Bruno's remaining composure. Hot, highly sudden tears aggressively pricked his exhausted eyes. He desperately attempted to actively speak, to softly say a simple hello. But his dry throat had completely, violently, closed completely up. Mariana slowly turned completely around. She smoothly followed her beautiful son's highly innocent gaze. Her piercing eyes violently landed completely on the pathetic valet. For exactly one highly agonizing heartbeat, absolutely nothing massive happened. The freezing, cold drizzle beautifully fell completely silently, entirely around them. The highly chaotic noise entirely of the massive city completely faded, entirely away. Then, the highly absolute recognition flawlessly dawned. It absolutely wasn't highly dramatic. She absolutely did not violently gasp. She absolutely did not dramatically clutch her expensive pearls. Her beautiful eyes simply, highly subtly, widened exactly a highly microscopic fraction. She meticulously absorbed the highly cheap, pathetic uniform, the highly wet, cheap shoes, the highly unkempt, graying hair, the highly pathetic plastic name tag that explicitly read, Julio. Bruno violently braced completely himself. He highly fully expected her to highly maliciously mock him. He fully expected her to highly loudly laugh. He fully expected her to highly lightly tap Ricardo's massive shoulder and toxically say, "Look intensely, my beautiful love. Look exactly at the highly pathetic trash." He miraculously, almost desperately wanted her to actually do it. He profoundly felt he entirely deserved the blinding anger. Blinding anger would highly explicitly mean that he absolutely still massively mattered, even exactly if highly negatively. But Mariana absolutely did not violently get angry. Her beautiful expression flawlessly softened. Her slender shoulders slightly, beautifully dropped. She intensely looked directly at him completely, with a highly profound, completely overwhelming, absolute sadness. It was the exact, highly specific look you generously give completely to a highly pathetic, beaten street dog that has been violently kicked so incredibly many massive times that it literally cannot be highly safely approached. It was pure, unadulterated pity. Absolute, completely indifferent, massive pity. She absolutely did not loudly say his pathetic name. She absolutely did not toxically acknowledge their highly toxic past. She absolutely did not politely ask exactly how he actively was. She simply, smoothly turned her beautiful head completely back directly to her highly powerful husband and her beautiful son. "It is completely freezing cold, Ricardo," she stated incredibly softly. "Let's aggressively get little Leo securely inside the warm jet. He is actively shivering." "Absolutely immediately," Ricardo firmly stated. He smoothly turned directly to Bruno. Ricardo absolutely did not vividly recognize him. Entirely to Ricardo Vargas. Bruno Torres was absolutely nothing more than a highly pathetic footnote. A highly minor, insignificant antagonist, completely in the absolute first, highly toxic chapter entirely of his beautiful life, completely with Mariana. He was so incredibly, pathetically insignificant that he absolutely didn't even magically register completely as highly familiar. "Highly excellent service," Ricardo stated, his deep voice incredibly brusque, but highly kind. He smoothly reached completely into his expensive coat pocket and flawlessly pulled completely out a crisp bill. He gently pressed it entirely into Bruno's shaking hand. "Aggressively stay completely warm," Ricardo stated. Bruno slowly looked completely down. It was a highly pristine, brand new crisp $100 bill. Benjamin Franklin intensely stared directly at him, highly toxically mocking him. "Thank you so incredibly much, sir," Bruno whispered incredibly softly. His deep voice was a highly broken, pathetic wheeze, utterly unrecognizable even completely to himself. Ricardo fiercely nodded and smoothly turned completely around, beautifully guiding his highly perfect family directly toward the highly exclusive, private entrance entirely of the luxury hotel. Exactly where their massive car would seamlessly take them directly to the private airport. "Bye-bye," Leo happily called completely over Ricardo's massive shoulder, happily giving exactly another highly tiny, gloved wave. Bruno slowly raised a highly violently trembling hand and generously gave a highly small, incredibly weak wave completely back by. He silently, highly pathetically mouthed completely without any sound. He intensely watched them confidently walk completely away. He vividly saw Ricardo gently lean completely in and softly whisper, absolutely something incredibly sweet, entirely to Mariana. And vividly saw Mariana beautifully rest her soft head completely on Ricardo's broad shoulder. They confidently moved exactly as a highly complete unit. A highly solid, utterly unbreakable, beautiful circle entirely of pure warmth and absolute love. They were a highly true, beautiful family. And Bruno was absolutely just the highly pathetic man who had violently opened the heavy door. When the highly heavy, massive glass doors entirely of the luxury hotel smoothly closed completely behind them, violently cutting entirely off the beautiful vision. The highly freezing silence entirely of the dark street violently rushed completely back. The freezing wind aggressively howled, violently whipping completely around the hard corner entirely of the massive building. Bruno intensely looked directly at the crisp $100 bill entirely in his shaking hand. In his highly toxic former life, he would have arrogantly used exactly this to highly casually light an incredibly expensive cigar. He would have casually given exactly this massive tip entirely to a cheap waitress, simply entirely for smoothly bringing him free water. He would have loudly laughed entirely at the absolute insignificance entirely of it. Now, this highly pathetic piece entirely of cheap paper was the absolute massive difference completely between actively eating and violently starving. It was the absolute difference completely between pure warmth and violently freezing, completely to death. He aggressively gripped the crisp bill incredibly tightly, his pale knuckles turning pure white. A highly pathetic, massive sob violently grew completely in his heavy chest, a highly irregular, incredibly painful thing that he literally could not successfully repress. He heavily leaned his weak back completely against the freezing, cold stone wall entirely of the luxury hotel, slowly sliding completely down entirely until he was heavily crouched, completely on the freezing, wet sidewalk. He had aggressively spent his entire, pathetic life meticulously building a massive, highly toxic fortress entirely of cold money, entirely to aggressively keep highly genuine people completely away, arrogantly thinking that it magically made him incredibly strong. He had highly toxically treated beautiful people exactly as pathetic assets, toxic liabilities, and cheap commodities. He had violently, ruthlessly thrown completely away the absolute only beautiful woman who had ever fiercely loved him completely for absolutely free. Absolutely all entirely, because he arrogantly wanted a highly fake, toxic reflection that visually looked significantly better entirely in a highly pathetic magazine. He desperately wanted to aggressively be an absolute king. And exactly now, he profoundly knew the absolute, brutal truth. Kings are absolutely just highly pathetic men, completely in fake costumes. Absolute, true power. Absolutely wasn't completely in the heavy crown. It was completely in the highly soft hand you fiercely held, exactly when the freezing snow aggressively began to violently fall. Mariana had successfully, beautifully, found a highly strong hand to fiercely hold. Bruno possessed absolutely nothing completely except his highly freezing hands entirely in his empty pockets. "Hey, Julio!" Mane violently yelled completely from the highly cheap valet booth, utterly oblivious entirely to the highly shattered ruins, entirely of the pathetic man, completely on the ground. "Completely stop pathetically counting your highly cheap tips. We officially possess a highly cheap Corolla aggressively arriving. Get the hell moving." Bruno violently wiped his wet face completely with the highly rough, cheap sleeve entirely of his pathetic jacket. He took a highly massive, violently trembling deep breath. The freezing cold air violently burned his heavy lungs, violently bringing him completely back entirely to highly harsh reality. "Actively going," he croaked pathetically. He slowly stood completely up. He frantically smoothed his highly cheap, way too incredibly oversized jacket. He carefully placed the highly crisp 100 bill, the highly pathetic charity entirely from his successful ex-wife's powerful husband, entirely in his deep pocket. Right, completely next, entirely to his highly pathetic, cheap bus pass. He confidently walked directly toward the highly dented, cheap Corolla, aggressively stopping entirely at the wet curb. He smoothly opened the heavy door, flawlessly forced a highly fake, pathetic smile completely onto his face, and heavily bowed his head. "Welcome completely to the Grand Plaza," Bruno whispered incredibly softly. "Exactly how may I actively help you?"